So it is my pleasure now to introduce our first speaker, Professor Cara Daggett. She is an assistant professor of political science at Virginia Tech. She researches the politics of energy and the problems confronting just fuel transitions. Her book, The Birth of Energy, Fossil Fuels, Thermodynamics, and the Politics of Work, published by Duke University Press in 2019, won the Clay Morgan Award for Best Book in Environmental Political Theory and the Yale H. Ferguson Book Award for International Studies Association Northeast. She has published widely on topics of energy transition, global justice, and feminist politics, including in the journals Energy, Research and Social Science, Environmental Politics, and Millennium, Journal of International Studies. She received her bachelor's degree in biochemical sciences from Harvard University, a master's of science in international relations from London School of Economics and Political Science, and her PhD in political science from Johns Hopkins University. The title of her talk today is Desiring Energy, How Work and Freedom Fuel Narratives Block and Adjust Transition. So let me read that again. Desiring Energy, How Work and Freedom Fuel Narratives Block, Adjust, Transition. It is my pleasure to welcome Professor Daggett. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. All right, it is indeed my pleasure to be here today and talk about environmental justice and particularly energy justice, which is close to my heart in my research. As Professor Mahmoudi said, my talk is titled Desiring Energy. And at first, this probably seems like an obvious observation. Who doesn't want energy? Having less energy feels like giving something up, like a sacrifice that we might make in the name of something else, like climate justice. Today, I'd like to disrupt a little how we think about energy and how we think about desire and energy. And I'm going to start with some history about energy. What is energy anyway? Fuel, to those of us who think about the environment, and that's probably what most of you assumed I'd be talking about today, and you're not completely wrong. So you know I'm not here to talk about gravity or how well I slept last night or how my coffee is sitting with me. Energy in this context is the thing we need to drive the economy, to do stuff. And much of the work on energy policy, indeed almost all of it, has this kind of technocratic basis. At the end of the day, energy is something that we can count, we secure, we might make it more efficient, we might make it green. But energy is also a capacious concept. It's a word of modern science, a unit underlying change across the cosmos. It's a popular term in New Age philosophies, meaning life force, flow, and change. So all these meanings are mixed together in popular discourse about energy. And in my research, I'm interested in this broader cultural and emotional behemoth called energy, especially how it's understood in the West, which I think is the dominant way of speaking about it in environmental politics too. What I found is that energy also reveals how Westerners in particular see ourselves, because I include myself here, as related to the more than human world. And to give away the answer, Westerners believe that humans are those who can and should put the world to work. But I didn't know that when I first started researching my book, The Birth of Energy. All I knew was that energy was this rich, complicated thing, and I wanted to know how it came to mean fuel in politics and how it came to stand for this major environmental problem of our time. In other words, I wanted to do what Foucault calls a genealogy. A genealogy means looking into the history of what feels like common sense, It means trying to find out when and why a common sense emerged to disrupt its naturalness. Foucault is especially interested in genealogies of science, and he looked at medical and biological sciences. And that was precisely because science markets itself as being without history, as objective discoveries of natural fact. In Western culture, this claim of objectivity gives science a lot of political authority. And this is based on the assumption that ethical knowing, or knowing about justice, and scientific knowing are totally separate epistemologies, separate pursuits. And science often gets the upper hand here for being universal, devoid of particularity and squishy feelings. This is how I learned about science too, as an undergraduate biochemistry major. But once I started reading histories and philosophies of science on the side, and then feminist science studies, I began to develop a more complicated view. The renowned feminist science scholar and biologist Donna Haraway tells us that nature and culture are not separate. She collapses them into one word: nature cultures. Haraway uses the biological cell as an example. She says cells are historical figurations. So what can this mean? Well, cells are really real material things that we can see under a microscope, but they are also inflected with language and social values in the metaphorical weight of the word cell and what it conveys in Western cultures, particularly about our notions of boundaries, borders, and exchange. So cells are both and rather than either or. This kind of nature culture methodology is how I wanted to think about energy. It's not an easy thing to do a genealogy, and Foucault never tried his method on the so-called hard sciences, and energy is from the hardest of hard sciences, physics and also engineering. Most of us would concede that the word energy is historical, but modern science would still maintain that the thing that energy points to is a universal cosmic truth. Fuel and human fights over fuel is just a particular manifestation of energy, a layer of politics on top of this natural fact. Simple, right? Well, that's precisely Foucault's point in a genealogical method, that these scientific terms that seem to be universal and ahistorical are not. Asking the simple question, how did energy become energy as moderns know it, very quickly disrupted some assumptions that myself and many Americans make about energy and politics. So first, although energy feels very old, unlike matter or force, which do have ancient pedigrees, energy is a very new scientific concept. And I didn't know this when I started out on my research, even though I had taken some advanced physics courses as an undergraduate. Energy emerges only in the 19th century with thermodynamics. Prior to the 19th century, energy was a rarely used word. It had mostly poetic and philosophical connotations that stemmed from Aristotle's original energeia. Of course, humans were using fuel, machines, and muscles before the 19th century and talking about things like life force and conservation, but there wasn't an organized knowledge that connected all of these activities. Second, the laws of thermodynamics denote energy as this universal thing that doesn't change across all transformations. At the same time, energy appeared to me to be wound up with fossil fuels, a fossil fuel knowledge. That's because it was only through tinkering with steam engines and wanting to figure out how burning coal could move pistons in order to make those engines more efficient that scientists devised the notion of energy through thermodynamics. Finally, it turns out that the more you dig into the science of energy, the more you realize that it's not a settled concept, even or especially within physics. Energy is not a material thing like Haraway's cells, but rather a mathematical relationship that is useful to describing many closed systems, but that theoretical physicists sometimes feel free to ignore in others. Lest you think that this is just a failed undergraduate science major who's now a humanities person reading the physics wrong, I want to share some great quotes from famous physicists about how weird energy is. Noticing that energy is actually more of an epistemology or a way of understanding the world than it is a thing or a fact. So first, this is Richard Feynman from his famous lectures at Caltech in the 60s. And he says, it's important to realize in physics today, we have no knowledge of what energy is. We don't have a picture that energy comes in little blobs of a definite amount. It's not that way. However, there are formulas for calculating some numerical quantity, and when we add it all together, it gives the same number. And second, my favorite quote was from Nobel laureate Percy Bridgman, who says the laws of thermodynamics have a different feel from most of the other laws of physics. There's something more palpably verbal about them. They smell more of their human origin. Why should we expect nature to be interested, either positively or negatively, in the purposes of human beings, particularly purposes of such unblushingly economic tinge? So here we have someone unlike Haraway, who assumes that physics should be separate from a human touch. But even with this assumption, is noticing that there's something about thermodynamics that is decidedly not that way. I only have time to briefly mention the laws of thermodynamics here, but I think it's worth doing because I want to point to their political effects, the way they echo into politics and bring that economic tinge that Bridgman refers to. So let's go back to that moment of the birth of thermodynamics when energy was supposedly discovered. J.M.W. Turner painted this at about the same time and place that energy was born. It's titled Rain, Steam, and Speed from 1844. Steam engines had been running for decades at this point, transforming ways of life, but they were very inefficient. Indeed, they were more inefficient than water power was at this time. No one knew how they worked, how heat produced motion. And I like to think that in Turner's paintings of a newly industrializing country, you can see the real uncertainty and anxiety surrounding these changes to landscapes and ways of life. The first scientists of energy were motivated by the desire to make this hazy picture more ordered, to make steam engines more efficient, to wreak as much work as possible out of every lump of coal. To do so, it turns out you have to get better at tracking this unruly thing called energy. When applied to governing an engine, it could be figured something like this. So the first law of thermodynamics explained that the energy of the inputs, and here you have fuel powering bodies and machines, would equal the energy of the outputs, the work done. The form of energy might change, but that underlying quantity of energy would stay the same. It could be tracked and would give you either work, matter moved, or waste, heat and friction, and other things. Unfortunately for humans, there was also a second law of thermodynamics. And the first law was this kind of tidy conservation law that really was in keeping with a balanced notion of nature. The second law had a much more tragic edge, and that was that entropy tends to increase. So this means that even if something called energy is conserved across a transformation, energy tends to spontaneously dissipate into forms that cannot do work. In other words, there's a one-way direction to heat reactions, especially like what happens in a steam engine and also what happens in our bodies. Once a lump of coal is used, you can't have it back. If it's wasted, in the words of Lord Kelvin, who is one of the so-called discoverers of energy, that potential work is, quote, lost to man irrecoverably. In Northern Britain, where energy was supposedly discovered, and also where shipbuilding and Scottish Presbyterianism and British imperialism were converged, these measurements of work and waste were overlain with moral and spiritual meaning. So this slide shows how this engine model could be applied to the governance of work, where work in this period begins to be understood as a site of energy transformation. All activity could be understood and calculated in terms of energy and tracked according to how efficiently it was used, how much was wasted, how much was getting to be put to work. Human work gets valued according to its proximity to production. Reproduction and care were merely supportive, although they also demanded efficiency. And those activities that used energy with no benefit to production were to be tracked down and policed as waste. And this kind of policing of waste, in my book, I really unpack how much it was practiced and governed with racialized and gendered understandings of what counts as work. In other words, energy fed into an ideology called productivism. Anson Robbenbach is a historian who describes productivism as a belief that arose in the midst of 19th century industrialization. So once again, right when energy is being born into science. And productivism is, quote, the belief that human society and nature are linked by the primacy and identity of all productive activity, whether of laborers, of machines, or of natural forces. So through productivism, human labor seemed natural, a reflection of physical laws. At the same time, the non-human world was treated as industrial, like this earth of metallic parts on the cover of The Economist. The world, in Robbenbach's words, becomes, quote, a vast protean reservoir of labor power awaiting its conversion to work. And you can still hear this kind of understanding of the landscape in the world in the way, for example, we talk about the desert where sunlight is falling without being put to use by solar panels. So even when we talk about renewable energy, the same tools you would apply to make an engine more efficient to get more work out of it could be applied to human bodies, cities, and empires. Energy is what made these activities comparable and calculable as work. It was what could be governed because it could be counted according to an engineer's demand for efficiency. Energy becomes a very attractive tool to serve the project of accumulation. It's especially useful to the field of engineering, which is born right around this time in the 19th century, tightly connected to the new science of energy, and also a field that has always been closely aligned to capitalism. Engineers were the mine managers, the factory experts. So when we talk about how we think about energy in politics, this engineer's understanding of energy is one particular dimension of energy that has become dominant. This is kind of the key argument of my book. And in engineering, energy is frequently described as the ability to do work, which, if you've been listening, is already a little strange because we've already said that energy can run down into forms that can't do work. That's entropy. So nevertheless, we have energy as the ability to do work where we're already kind of deciding what kind of energy we value. Power in engineering is the rate of work done. And in energy politics, these physical definitions are often conflated with their political terms. So decades before the science of thermodynamics, the first engine tinkerers conflated these things, as in this quotation from Matthew Boulton, who was a partner of James Watt. And he says, "I sell here, sir, what all the world desires to have, power." And of course, he's talking about the steam engine. When we speak about energy, work, or power, these terms are still haunted by its engineering side. This story about Western industrialism and productivism is perhaps familiar to many of us, but energy plays a foundational and often unexamined role in it. Energy is important not only as the thing that is either doing work or getting wasted, energy also lends this whole ideology of productivism an aura of scientific authority. The universe itself seems to validate the Anglo-European project of putting the world to work. It seems to verify the goodness of turning fuel into power. The Anglo-Protestant belief in thrift and self-discipline and the related Western work ethic gets further reinforced in this period by energy physics. And there's a slippage going on here between the needs of capital and the laws of nature. This is that economic tinge that Bridgman was talking about. And that's because the mathematical equations don't really tell us how to value energy. They don't tell us what waste is. They don't tell us what energy is useful and what's not useful. And yet, energy as defined by thermodynamics has helped to license the modern sense that there is a linear relationship between energy and progress. So freedom from any limits imposed upon energy is conflated with political freedom. Life with less energy appears as if it would be nasty, brutish, and short. And that message resonates because work is still understood to be central to citizenship and dignity in the modern West. Even many on the left have learned to couch their demands in the language of productivism, of expanding work, which is built upon that productivist orientation to the earth. So one through line of my book is that this nexus of energy and work and freedom remains dominant in how the West understands energy today. And even when we talk about renewable energy, as I'll show, these common sense feelings about energy get mapped on to other fuels. So now I want to take this history and turn to the narratives around energy that we see in US politics today and dissect them, and I hope start to make them feel a little strange in terms of understanding and seeing how this common sense plays out. All right, so many of us know that this year, President Biden reversed a lot of Trump's environmental rollbacks, including putting a halt on new oil and gas leases. So this figure captures the extent of the anti-environmentalist policies of the Trump administration. These are tracking all the rollbacks under Trump in different areas of the environment. The fossil fuel industry was furious with Biden, and they revved up their multi-million-dollar PR machine. They trumpeted the two stories that are repeated ad nauseum in defense of fossil fuels and in praise of energy more broadly. The first story is about work, that climate action or environmental regulation kills jobs. And you can see that in these tweets. This is from the American Petroleum Institute and Republican Senator Barrasso. But Biden too takes up this concern and debate about jobs. Indeed, it's hard to underestimate the centrality of jobs to the defense of fossil fuels, but also to debates about energy in politics today. So as Biden said when he announced his plans, today is Climate Day at the White House, which means it's Jobs Day at the White House. And climate mitigation has become part of a bill that isn't called the Climate Act or the Green New Deal, but the American Jobs Plan. Of course, this is a bit of political theater, counting upon the bread and butter appeal of jobs to carry a sweeping act through Congress. However, it is that very appeal, that assumption about desire, the connection in the public imagination between jobs, energy, and well-being, that's part of the ecological problem. Why? Well, the promise of green jobs is on shaky ground for at least three reasons. First, because the more jobs, more solar panels logic doesn't on its own get rid of fossil fuels. Biden's plan is to be partly funded by ending fossil fuel subsidies, which is a start, But evidence shows that adding renewable energy does not substitute out fossil fuels on a one-to-one basis. So far, the result of more solar and wind has been more energy consumption overall. Relatedly, the green jobs promise will not necessarily get to the heart of the problem of work in late capitalism. That problem includes automation, wage stagnation, the stripping of public benefits, the exploitation of migrant and global South labor, and that reproductive labor continues to be underpaid or unpaid. Biden and other Green New Deal plans try to address pieces of this. The more progressive the plans, the more they try to capture this. But at the end of the day, the focus on how many jobs get created distracts from making these more radical challenges to how we value work and which kinds of work are being valued. The claim of more green jobs also gets bogged down in accounting debates that I don't think are particularly helpful, like how few people are needed to actually maintain wind turbines, how many of these jobs will be located in rural areas, and the fact that many of the available jobs in former coal field and gas communities are so-called pink collar jobs like nursing and teaching. Finally, it's a strategic error for the left to think that promising jobs will get to the heart of the matter in terms of fossil fuel support. In some former fossil fuel bound regions of the US, like Appalachia, where I am right now, or Texas, where many of my family lives, fossil fuels have become potent conservative symbols, rather than direct employers for many who live there. A small fossil fuel elite stands to lose trillions of dollars. That's true, and capitalism itself will be challenged without easy access to oil and gas. Neither fossil fuels nor fossil capitalism, though, make much economic sense for many Americans, much less for the planet. But coal and oil do more than ensure profit. As I've been showing, energy, and fossil fuels most notably, also secures cultural meanings and political subjectivities. This is why I want to emphasize that energy transition is not as simple as switching fuel types. It's not just about technology. And as Professor Mahmoudi told us in the opening remarks, it's about people too. And it's about desire. Ending fossil fuels is experienced by some as an identity and cultural challenge, and one that some feel should be resisted, even violently. This connects to our second energy story that I want to dissect today, which is also trumpeted by fossil fuel PR. And that story is about freedom, that climate action threatens something called American energy independence. This story has to do with Western understandings of freedom and sovereignty. And these tweets are from Mike Summers, who's the president of the American Petroleum Institute, and a former Republican representative of Oklahoma, Kendra Horn. As with the job story, this energy freedom story is evident across the political spectrum. Here's Obama recognizing the long duration of the fear of foreign oil. So he says, we've known about the dangers of oil dependence for decades, and every president since Nixon has talked about freeing ourselves from dependence on foreign oil. And notice, and this is in the context, by the way, of the fracking boom of the 21st century in the US. Notice the background for his talk on energy security, which says, winning the future, American energy, such that losing energy is equated with a losing America. It's important to unpack these stories because they do have a powerful cultural cachet. They play upon common sense understandings of energy that infect both fossil fuels and renewable energy projects, and that need to be challenged if we are to achieve anything like a just transition. The core set of emotional relationships cultivated here are between energy, work, and freedom. And I've shown you a little bit about how that nexus was born in the heart of Western science in the 19th century and its connections to capitalism and empire. In terms of energy politics today, I've also been interested in how gender identities feature in this nexus of work and freedom, and in particular, how hegemonic masculinities intensify the emotional and affective charge of these stories about fuel. And this is research that I did and wrote about in the wake of the election of Trump. And I was interested in how the Me Too movement and concerns about misogyny on the right were somehow a separate dimension from the support for fossil fuels and climate denial. And I wanted to think about how these were related. Energy desires are entangled with American hegemonic masculine identities. And I called this Petromasculinity. And I was looking at fossil fuel support, toxic masculinity, and authoritarianism on the far right and how they come together. Petromasculinity is a variation upon traditional white hegemonic masculinities. And it's best understood as you see on this slide, as a hypermasculinity. In the wake of September 11th, feminist international relations scholars Anna Agathangelou and Lily Ling identified hypermasculinity as masculine identities that take a more, quote, reactionary stance. They arise when agents of hegemonic masculinity feel threatened and need to inflate and exaggerate their traditional masculinity. In other words, petromasculinity is a wannabe hegemonic masculinity that feels itself to be under threat. And petromasculinity describes how unbounded energy consumption becomes a performance of power in a world seen as increasingly threatening. So I'm interested in how the threat posed by climate change, the threat to fossil fuel systems, and the threat to white patriarchal rule have become interwoven as related forces in this story and help to feed the desire for authoritarianism. The fossil fuel PR machine counts on these desires, relying upon a petro-nostalgia, amplified by the Make America Great Again message, which is an homage to a mid-20th century fantasy of American life when white men ruled their household. It's no coincidence that white conservative American men, regardless of class, appear to be among the most vociferous climate deniers. The achievement of a 1950s patriarchal ideal in the US was built upon a steady supply of fossil fuels. Cars, suburbs, highways, and the nuclear family were oriented especially around white male workers. That infrastructure yoked the desires of Americans to the never-ending supply of fossil energy that made the dream possible. No wonder that having plentiful gas and energy and oil came to seem essential for American well-being. So even while we might debate, is healthcare a right, is housing a right, there's this widespread and often unexamined agreement that we have a right to cheap energy, for example. The explosive power of combustion could be crudely equated with virility and also with freedom, that second energy story, where freedom meant the ability to do what you like with your property, to burn, to produce, to expand on land stolen from indigenous peoples who were seen as incapable of putting that land to work to its full capacity. The Trump administration termed this a policy of energy domination. It was, like so many things related to that administration, not really a brand new policy, just an unabashed declaration of what had really been going on all along with US imperialism and fossil fuels. And so we can see Rick Perry, the Texan who served as the Secretary of Energy for Trump, gleefully promoting American exports of what he called freedom gas abroad. So he said, increasing export capacity is critical to spreading freedom gas throughout the world, giving America's allies a supply of clean energy. Apparently, natural gas is made from molecules of US freedom. Just as American soldiers liberated Europe from the Nazis, Perry explained, America was liberating once again with its fossil fuels. At first blush, this is fun to laugh at, and maybe if we weren't in a Zoom talk, I would hear some chuckles. But it should also be taken as a serious explanation of how fossil fuels fit into narratives about American sovereignty. Here, soldier bodies and gas molecules are righteous means to achieving freedom. This is a freedom, first and foremost, from foreign oil. This fear reached a fever pitch in the 1970s during the so-called oil crisis. At this time, the fear of foreign oil drove a lot of misguided policy that continues to reverberate in how Americans understand not only the oil economy, but our involvement in the Middle East. In his recent book, Oilcraft, Bob Vitalis, a scholar of the Middle East, takes to task all claims that America goes to war to secure its oil supply. Producer countries would have no interest in significantly holding back oil to the global market, Vitalis notes. And even if some have, others have historically taken their place. The supply and price disruptions of the 1970s were more to do with existing US export quotas that have been protecting domestic US oil extractors, as well as the broader weakening of the US economy. Even though the security of oil supplies was not really the main problem, Vitalis does point out how fears about foreign oil effectively amplified the perception of crisis. And these fears are racialized. In the 1970s, foreign oil meant Arab oil. Oil from Canada or Mexico were not understood as problematic in the same way. So let's think more now about what freedom and independence mean in this story. Freedom from foreign oil means freedom conceived of as independence, as not dependent upon others who are deemed threatening. This is based upon a white and masculinized notion of freedom for an upright self who needs no one and who controls his domain, whether his household or his nation. Work is central to this vision of freedom because that idealized self is by definition productively employed. This person is neither dependent nor, God forbid, idle. In Western culture, we think about dependency as set within hierarchical power relations. Dependency connotes subordination, constraint. To be free is to move up that ladder toward independence. Of course, this ideal flies in the face of reality at multiple levels. Life is deeply enmeshed in relations of dependency, and not just between humans. From an anthropocentric view of global energy politics, the idea that the US is energy independent as a result, for example, of domestic fracking is delusional, given its heavy reliance upon global supply chains and global credit to support its massive debt. So the fantasy of independence requires the erasure of these dependencies, which include reproductive labor, underpaid work, and the more than human world. I'm working through this Western fear of dependency in order to push against the idea that this fear is universal or part of human nature. This fear, like the anti-globalism of climate deniers, touches upon something at the heart of the American project of freedom. I think the fear of dependency reflects the fragility of the Western freedom project. It's a master's fear. Ironically, those at the top are the most dependent of all. The American way of life depends upon not having our debts come due. So the desire for independence is the anxiety of a debtor facing the constant growth of their debt. Too often we think of growth as this overly optimistic desire for expansion, but it's also built upon anxiety, a need to outrun our obligations and our dependencies. Growth comes to feel like the only way to avoid a just redistribution of land and money. Obviously, we've strayed a bit from energy, but hopefully it's become clearer that an energy transition needs to go much deeper than a shift in fuel technology. The capacious notion of energy is tied to problematic Western stories about work and freedom. The idea of unlimited energy is the desire to take without reciprocating. And in my last couple of minutes, I want to show you how these stories also get mapped onto wind and solar. So here's the Tesla truck and the EV Hummer. And you can see here we've got military styling and references to domination. We also have the gentler masculinity of, this is the Will Ferrell commercial from the Super Bowl where he's anxious about America losing to Norway in terms of EVs. And I also want to play two advertisements from Solar City, a company that has now become Tesla Energy. And these really, I think, show you how solar and wind can be also conceived of as ways to escape from dependency upon the natural world and upon the labor of others. So here's Solar City contrasting solar panels to gas.
Solar City presents how natural gas power gets to you. Beginning tiny marine animals such as algae and plankton soak up rays from the sun and over hundreds of millions of years become natural gas. At some point, men in matching vests start looking for the gas, undeterred by the fact that they can't see it, smell it, or taste it. Gassy. So they drill holes in the mountains, in the ocean, in the desert. When they find the gas gulf flat, they build wells and pump it to the surface for a fleet of ships and nasal pipes, or both. Deliver it to a compressor, then it's burned to turn a turbine. Say that 3 times fast, which powers a generator, which converts it to electricity for your home. And this is how solar power gets to you. Solar City, power forever.
All right, and
Solar City presents.
This is a commercial similarly that is about escaping from domestic dependencies, and it has also some troubling racial and cultural work going on here.
What's with the new housekeeper?
Oh, no. We switched to Solar City. No upfront costs, lowered our monthly bill. Now we have the infinite power of the sun working for us 24/7. Hey. We just put him on a new diet. He's just hungry all the time.
Put the infinite power of the sun to work and
So we see here, there's a lot to unpack, but I think you can see this masculinized dream of independence, of power forever, of technology that frees us from nature and can be clean, untainted by the demands of miners in the global south, of household labor that is provided without the discomfort of servitude, and of the promised stability of an American way of suburban life. The underbelly of this fantasy is that any call to recognize these dependencies feels like giving up freedom, something done as a sacrifice rather than along the lines of desire. And this might be the most insidious problem with these two stories, because when they're accepted, environmentalists get sorted into two camps: those who promise to keep the American way of life, the eco-modernists, and those asking that we give things up, that we must discipline our desires. But by being aware of these stories as troubling cultural constructs, we can disrupt them rather than operate within their frameworks. That's where desire comes in. Fossil fuel PR has already decided in advance what is desirable. But these dreams are vulnerable to disruption because they have failed to deliver well-being to most people. We shouldn't attack them, though, through the Protestant tropes of guilt and discipline. That would be to accept that freedom must mean independence. Freedom might also mean a kind of sufficiency achieved through relations of dependency that are mutual rather than extractive. The catch is that there needs to be a material transformation of land, labor, and money for such a freedom to function. It's not just as a matter of justice or of paying back what is owed. It's also a matter of building new worlds in which dependency could be fulfilling rather than exhausting, as it is now for so many. A matter of taking care of those of us who care, taking care of those who care for us, human and more than human. That kind of freedom is filled with obligations. but it's also liberated from these enormous debts, from the anxiety that drives the constant need to grow. It would be a freedom to be longed for rather than feared. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Daggett, for that very informative talk, and especially your slides helped to carry us through not only the history of energy, but also where we are now with the conflicts and the contestation that we see going on in our, especially our Western society. So with that, I would now like to ask our viewers to please pose their questions. This is the time to go to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen and address your questions to Dr. Daggett. Maybe I can start out by asking, you said that there's this idea that growth is the only way to avoid having to share land and energy. And I wondered if you could say a little bit about how do you see this whole movement towards needing to share energy and share land? How do you see that if we were to say, let's look at the practical means of reaching this kind of an ideal? Could you speak to that, please?
Yeah, so there's been some interesting work done around getting beyond measures of GDP and economic growth, which I think most of us understand are not really good measures of the health of a society, and looking at broader measures of health and well-being, and associating that with levels of energy consumption. And there is really good evidence that having more energy does correlate to better health and well-being to a point. And at that point, there's kind of a plateauing. And the US is well beyond that point in terms of average energy consumption. And so I think this is another binary that in terms of practical policy, this gets bogged down in, that somehow to talk about how we use energy would be to shut off people who have energy poverty from getting the energy that they need. It's more about looking at more privileged and kind of over consumers of energy and asking, is this really correlated to our well-being and happiness? I think for most of us, it's not. But we're kind of caught in a system where it's almost necessary. And then, the other thing I really want to resist is that so much then gets pushed back onto us as individual consumers, that we're supposed to make these individual choices. And so I want us to think, how can we build infrastructures that would allow us to enjoy more of our social and communal life, but with less energy, down to things like closing down streets to be pedestrian only, having really pleasurable and safe bike lanes, public transit, so on and so forth. I think I think we have all the ideas we need. It's about getting this kind of public imagination and desire behind that.
Thank you very much. I see a hand up, Dr. Williston.
Yeah, thank you. That was a wonderful talk. Thanks very much for that. I wonder if you could say something a little bit more maybe about how we overcome the way that the concept or the value of freedom is articulated, especially in the United States, because it's so, this idea of freedom as the absolute lack of constraint, right? Like the pushing beyond all boundaries, all limits, the refusal to accept living with dependencies and so on. It just seems so culturally ingrained that it's difficult to see where you get a wedge in there culturally, right? And that runs straight up against exactly the sort of thinking that we require right now, like contained, for example, in the concept of planetary boundaries, that if we don't learn to think within boundaries, right, planetary boundaries, objectively set limits to our consumption and so on, then we're doomed as a species, essentially. So how do we get around that? How do we try and articulate, or begin to articulate, a way in which freedom and responsibility can somehow come together, or freedom and limits can somehow be thought of as co-constitutive concepts?
Well, I can't claim to have the all the answers, or even the answer. I think your question is exactly the question that needs to be posed, and I'm pushing us to try to pose it in the language of desire and pleasure, and not accept a framing that we're asking for discipline and giving things up, because even among the most privileged publics who enjoy this kind of freedom without constraint that you're talking about, it's quite easy to point to real ways that many people are hurting. Even in the US, people who are consuming a lot of mass commodities and a lot of energy. Everything from mental health to, we saw this in the pandemic, the people who doing the essential work, most exposed to illness, least taken care of by healthcare systems. So I think, in my book, I talk a little bit more about making an alliance between critiques of work and environmental movements, because what's been successful for a lot of local environmental justice movements has been a connection to health. And I think that's because it connects to people's lived experience, to their bodies, to their loved ones, and well-being. And I think work does the same thing. If we start to think about justice at work, most of us can relate to that and realize the ways in which modern work is not really organized in a way that's fair or just to most people. So making these alliances on a practical level, I think, could be an important way forward.
Thank you. So the next question we have is from Connie Siebold. She says that I love that this was couched in a sort of constructionist framework, because it's not a topic that can be separated from cultural implications. What type of broadly usable and casual rhetoric do you believe could be used as a subtle, not agenda-based conversational hook for people who aren't pointedly aware of these issues?
Oh, it's a great question, because I have been, as anyone who writes a book knows, you have to develop kind of the elevator portion of your book all the way to, how do you tell your grandma what you're doing, to how do you talk to your friends, to how do you give a 40-minute talk. So I've tried a lot of different ways of explaining this. And it's why I ended up, again, in the book, going back to work, because it's easily understandable to people if you think about, if you just ask people about what energy or what purposeful activities are most valuable, and if you just start talking to people about what kinds of things they do matter, and then compare those to how they're valued by money, by wages, by how they're recognized. I think even within feminist movements, trying to push in the US towards having a better social support for childcare, and also for caring for all kinds of care work, that's something that's really been missing in a lot of mainstream US feminism, and other countries are much further ahead. And I think it's easy to see in movements like that how you could then relate that to energy consumption, which is where a lot of people go and say, instead of thinking about, you know, making modulations on a thermostat, which is important, let's think about, as a society, how could we build something that would be more enjoyable? To me, the lack is not, to me, the problem is not that we don't have a lot of ideas already of how to do it. It's precisely these questions, these first two questions is like, how do we, what's the cultural work? What's the kind of work of storytelling that needs to happen?
Thank you. The next question, could you address the strain on energy versus American culture of consumerism?
Yes. I do tend to think about consumerism very much within systems of capitalism, and the way that in the 19th century, mass consumerism gets extended to a new working class. You know, sometimes it's too crude or simple to say as kind of an exchange for a world of work that was quite dismal, and for many remains quite unfair and dismal. But in some sense, that's still true. This is kind of the reward arm of capitalism. But more than that, if you think about it in terms of, for example, gender, I mean, a lot of this is a struggle I have with environmental movements that focus on individual consumers, is that a lot of the work that might be done by an individual to, you know, use less plastic, or think about different products in the house, or buying things that are going to last longer, that work falls on women often. I know this as a mother myself. And when you have women who are already unsupported in terms of care, it's a matter also, in other words, of time, you know, a justice around time and wages, and also bigger systems of what kinds of things are available. So that gets us, I think, to talking about industry and corporations instead of consumers. Like, what kinds of things are being allowed to be produced in terms of toxics? What kinds of pollution is allowed to happen on land without any obligations by those corporations? What kinds of life cycles are corporations responsible for their goods? And so I'd like to see the emphasis be there more, rather than on individual consumers who I think, yes, are over consuming, but are also often embedded in these other unjust systems in terms of their time and wages.
Thank you. If I may ask another question. You know, this, what you just touched upon, which is the individual versus the structures. I think this is really important, because sometimes I see individuals fighting with each other about, you know, who is more environmental conscious and this and that. And I think, and I understand it's all done in the good spirit of wanting to do something with what we are facing in terms of our energy crisis. Or environmental crisis. But my question is this, how do you see, if we were to look for solutions in terms of changing the structure, which means how would we move in the direction of finding ways to not abuse or overuse the energy available to us on this planet, right? In your view, and with the amazing research that you've done, what would that look like in a world that we live in today, which is so highly interconnected?
So what would a just energy system look like? So if I may advertise another thing I wrote with colleagues called Toward Feminist Energy Systems, Why Adding Women in Solar Panels is Not Enough. And in that article, we do try to imagine what would a feminist energy system look like. And we use feminism as just one potential way in here. There's other ways of critiquing power and other ways of thinking that could also be an entry point. But I think one takeaway is that there's not going to be one solution for everyone. I think that energy systems will be matched to bioregions or to local needs and cultures and available relations with land and water. Another thing will be this point that I got to towards the end of the talk about thinking about dependency not as something that's inherently the opposite of freedom or inherently about subordination, but is about relations. So building energy systems that acknowledge all of these obligations. And this is not to say that this is some kind of rainbow world where everything is positive, because clearly just the act of living as a person or an animal or a plant is in some ways a violent thing. This is what Haraway calls living with the trouble. But it's about recognizing all of these different relations and actually sort of dealing with them in a better way, as opposed to right now where they're hidden, they're made invisible, or they're dumped in a so-called away or zoned in kind of marginalized communities. So, I think this is something to be dreamed about by each community, but it would, to me, have to be about more than just building a grid. It would have to be about the space and time of how we work and how we eat and how we build our homes and our neighborhoods and how we build our towns. And so, it's everything from architecture to urban planning to art and design. So yeah, I alone, don't know exactly what it would look like, except I think that when you start by asking communities some of these questions, and this is something I'd like to do in research, but just in conversations I've had, people have a lot of really beautiful ideas if the question is posed this way, as opposed to a very technocratic, narrow discussion of fuel technology.
Thank you. I think Dr. Seaman has a question.
I do, thanks. So I was wondering, following on from what you just said at the end there in particular, have you seen any changes in the past year and a half, obviously with the pandemic, in how people are approaching these questions? Because obviously everybody's life has changed dramatically, and has that maybe opened up space for discussion or changed the way people are approaching the question? And I think tied to that, especially around some of the inequalities and inequities that the pandemic has exposed.
I think yes and no. So on the one hand, I feel some despair at the inability, especially in my country, the US, of people to have a kind of collective ethics. And it makes me, I often think in politics that health is one of the easiest things to mobilize around. When health is at stake, people are often motivated to do big things. As we saw, we did actually do some big things in terms of shutdowns and changing our lives. But in this case, to see these partisan divides persist through a health crisis is a little despairing if you think about, the ongoing kind of discord over climate action. On the other hand, there are some inklings and rays of hope that continue. And I think especially, Naomi Klein has her idea about disaster capitalism. And this is that capitalists often take advantage of a disaster or a crisis to kind of institute these big changes that then get left in place. So this power of inertia. And that has happened. I think we can all, even in the university, see how that has happened. However, I also see glimmerings of maybe a disaster socialism, for example, in the way that a lot of city streets got redesigned and reimagined, shut down to pedestrians, opened up to more convivial space. And then those are now, in some cities, being kind of permanently instituted. So there's been a longer movement, for example, in Barcelona called feminist urban design, or there's a feminist city lab. And this has really been about making the streets more for the people as opposed to for cars. But I see this happening in lots of cities, even in my little town of Blacksburg. So those are little things, but I think they are these kind of wedges that Byron mentioned that are a way in to show people how you could design differently.
Thank you so much. I think we will now stop the question and answer session, and to thank you again, Dr. Daggett, for a very, very informative talk. I wanted to remind our audience that your book that has won these prizes, the title is The Birth of Energy, Fossil Fuels, Thermodynamics, and the Politics of Work, and Duke University is the publisher. I encourage all of you to get this book and read it, because it really does provide us with incredible information about energy, and directly relates to what we're facing today in terms of both climate and environmental justice. So now we will take a break and come back at 10:45 Eastern Daylight Time, and then we'll continue with our next speaker. So again, my thanks to Dr. Daggett, and we'll see you back here at 10:30. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay.